Welcome everybody to this session here in the big hall entitled Towards an Arab Renaissance. I'm Fred Secret, Managing Director at the World Economic Forum, and I'm joined here by an extraordinary panel, quite a big panel. The good news is that nobody has speeches, so I can say that up front, and we're hoping to have a very interactive discussion with you, times for questions. We also have some short presentations, some slides, and also some voting devices that are hopefully on your chairs or in your hands, preferably. And we'll be using those as we move along during the session. I would like to welcome first His Highness Sheikh Salman bin Hamad Al Khalifa, who's known to all of us here as the Crown Prince of Bahrain, but also as one of the leading reformers in the Arab world. And I'd also, just on an anecdotal base, would like to congratulate you, sir, for having been the first Middle Eastern country having been able to bring to the Arab world the Formula One race. And on the 4th of April, there will be the first Grand Prix of Bahrain, Formula One race taking place in Bahrain. And I am sure that His Highness will be extending an invitation to all of you, taking the opportunity. So congratulations. And also some very good friends of the forum here. Andre Azoulay, who's the counselor to His Majesty the King of Morocco. We have the great pleasure also of having Gamal Mubarak, who heads the Policy Secretariat at the National Democratic Party in Egypt. Great to have you with us. Our good friend Minister Bassem Awadallah, who is the Minister of Planning and International Cooperation of Jordan, and also somebody who's very active on the reform front in the Arab world. And I'd like to welcome as well Richard Cooper, who is Professor of International Economics at Harvard University, who was also involved with the Carter administration and the Camp David scenarios on the economic side. And last but not least, Shafiq Gaber from Egypt, the chairman of ARTOC, who is the chairman of the Arab Business Council of the Forum, and Mohammed Alabar from Dubai, from Emaar Properties, who is a member of the executive committee as well of the Arab Business Council. So we are talking about a renaissance, but why? And every time we mention that word, some smiles often come up on our faces. But we know about the uneven governance situation in the Arab world, the low economic growth, the education deficit that's been highlighted in a number of UNDP reports, and the difficult social situation in the Arab world, where over 60% of the population is under the age of 25 years old. And yet, this region, between the 9th and the 13th centuries, was really sustaining and advancing all of the learnings that we had had from the Greeks, from the Jews, from the Romans, and it helped to lay the foundations for the age of many discoveries in the maritime field, in the astronomy field, and it also allowed the birth of a great European universities and education system, and eventually the Italian Renaissance. So that's why we're talking about a renaissance of the Arab world. This region was once great and has a tremendous heritage that perhaps has been diluted a little bit and needs to be brought to the fore. So a rebirth of Arab culture and society is overdue, especially when you put this against the backdrop of the challenges of globalization in the 21st century. And if we could achieve an Arab Renaissance, wouldn't this be one of the truest expressions of the theme of this year's annual meeting, partnering for prosperity and security, and it would also allow this vast region to take its rightful place in a tightly integrated global environment. That's the Renaissance that we would all like to see. Now, before we hear from some of our discussion leaders, I would like to turn to Derek Cooper, to sort of put this region in a global context, why is it that this region seems to be so lower than the global situation? Professor.
Do you want me up there?
I'd rather you sit, but if you're more comfortable standing.
No, either way. As you've just heard, I've been asked to provide a kind of overview context and then end up identifying some of the particular challenges that this region faces. If you stand back and take an Olympic view of the world economy over the last half century, it has done fantastically well. President Clinton, yesterday in his remarks, talked about the challenges ahead of us, and there are still many. But it is worth standing back from time to time and ask, how are we doing? And the answer is, not badly at all. Indeed, probably better than in any other period of human history. On the figures of the Indian economist Surjit Bala, world poverty in what we today call developing countries fell from 58, using the World Bank measure, fell from 58% in 1950 to 12% in the year 2000. It's a tremendous achievement. One region of the world stands out for not meeting what has become the average standard, and that is sub-Saharan Africa. The region that's on our agenda this morning, the Middle East, and in particular the Arab Middle East, is more or less at the average. There is a tremendous range of performance during the last decade between 1.5% growth per annum and nearly 6% per annum within this region, so there's great diversity, as indeed there is within most regions of the world. But the overall performance is about average, with about half of the countries achieving a growth rate in per capita income above the world average of 2.1%, the world average over the last 50 years. So the performance is, one would say, not bad, but nothing to write home about compared with some other parts of the world. Many opportunities is the way to put it. Many opportunities are still there by international standards and international experience. I want to talk about, and I hope we'll hear more both from the panel and from you in the audience about this morning, two special challenges that I see in this region. The first, which applies to only about half the countries, is what I would call the curse of oil. We usually think of oil as being a great benefactor, and of course everyone wants to discover oil or gas in his backyard. But if one looks at actual human experience, and we now have over half a century of it with lots of examples around the world, it turns out that most societies manage their oil wealth very badly. Very badly. And when you think about it, there are reasons for that. The main reason is that oil, the ratio between production costs on average and the yield on average is very substantial, creating what economists call rents. And there is, of course, develops a social struggle over who gets these rents. And the incentive structure, therefore, for any young man or woman, but it's typically a young man in this part of the world, as he organizes his life and looks where he should put his energies and his efforts, is getting some of the rents. Not doing things that are productive from a social point of view, but getting some of the rents. And of course this inhibits, and I talked about the spectrum of performance within this region. The correlation is not perfect, but in general, the performance of the oil-rich countries has, in terms of economic growth, has been worse than the performance of the countries that are not rich in oil. That's a paradox, but that's a fact. Now, it is worth making here a technical point that when we talk about growth, we're talking about growth in output, not growth in real income. And of course, countries that have oil, as the prices have gone up, as they have done during the last half century, incomes can grow more rapidly than output does. So the challenge here is how to manage oil wealth in such a way that it minimizes the perverse incentives to the productive members or the potentially productive members of society and maximizes the value in terms of capital formation interpreted broadly that oil wealth can bring. And that poses a very special challenge for government, which most governments, and I don't speak of governments only in this region, one only has to think of Nigeria, for example, or Venezuela in South America, two other oil-rich countries that have not managed their oil wealth well. The second challenge that I'll mention has to do with the nexus between population growth and education. Population growth is exceptionally high by world standards in this region. Again, there's a substantial dispersion, differences among countries of the region, but on average, it's a high population growth. Whatever one thinks about population in terms of family values and individual freedom and so forth, high population growth creates a challenge for education. If one looks forward in the 21st century and thinks that the key to success, however one defines that, is going to be a better informed, better educated populace, it becomes a social challenge how to educate large numbers of children. Just the simple fact of finding enough qualified teachers to educate a population that is growing at, say, 3% or 3% plus per year. And so this is another challenge which is not unique to this region, but it is a especially strong one in this region. And with posing those two challenges, I'd like to hear what the panel has to say about how to deal with them.
Thank you very much, Professor. Just to add on to the population growth issue, we were having a discussion earlier on in the week. Just wanted to provide two other interesting statistics in that respect, is that the labor force of the Middle East, North Africa region will be 146 million in 2010 and 186 million by 2020. And that to maintain the current levels of unemployment, there will be the need to create 80 million jobs in 17 years. And that equals an employment growth of about 4% per annum, which has not been achieved anywhere in the 20th century. I mean, I think that's putting the bar perhaps too high, but to go back to listening back to the panel, I think this is one of the reasons also why the business community from the Arab world of the forum wanted to, realizing these challenges were ahead of them and of the region, wanted to see how they could make a contribution. So I'd like to turn to you, Shafiq, to maybe just briefly describe the raison d'etre of the Arab Business Council, and more importantly, to have you and Mohammed Alabar briefly sketch out some of the ways in which you see the region through cooperation between governments and business and civil society being able to answer some of these challenges that the professor talked about.
Thank you, Fred. Ladies and gentlemen, the Arab business community had a severe wake-up call. It happened in the year 2002 in Geneva, when we had an Arab competitiveness conference that took place, organized by the World Economic Forum. The business community has been fragmented in the Arab world, working basically on national issues, national economic issues. The wake-up call that came on 2002 was not only the statistics that Fred and Professor Cooper has been alluding to, but the reality that we were losing our competitiveness. And we decided in 2002 to create the Arab Business Council, a council that would have as its mission statement one specific goal: to work on competitiveness and reform issues, to try and enhance and reinforce the importance of those two issues if we are going to be able to compete in this century. We tried to do this through two vehicles specifically: engaging with Arab governments and in issues related to economic development policies, but also becoming a collective voice of the Arab business community to talk about socioeconomic and specifically policies that can impact on things that can make competitiveness work. Competitiveness will not work just by economic liberalization. It will work if we pay attention to governance, pay attention to education, and pay attention to human resource development. What the Arab Business Council has been trying to do since its creation 6 months ago is to create a blueprint. This blueprint was approved, and let me tell you, as chairman of the executive committee, it's not been easy to get the Arab business community to agree on one thing, and there is a reason for that. There is no one-size-fits-all. This is not a homogeneous region. The reform issues and the issues that pertain to improving competitiveness are different from country to country. But the critical component is that there is a common denominator. And there is the need for a serious movement on these issues now. But we are not just going to remain by producing blueprints, which what happened yesterday is our very first document has come out, sort of outlining a framework where issues related to economic liberalization, human resource development, and governance are addressed. But also, what has been happening from the Arab business communities, we've been going to governments, engaging with them. And let me be very frank, some governments are extremely forthcoming. Some governments are a little bit hesitant about this whole process. And some governments are not still ready to engage with us. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think if we are able to develop a small community that moves forward, this is where it's going to make a major impact. Time is not on our side. Time is a factor that we need to engage with in a manner that can produce results. And that is why what the ABC is doing is challenging itself, because let me be very frank, it's not just governments that are an impediment to reform. Some of the private sector itself is an impediment to reform. Over the years, not only in the Arab world, but in many different places in developing countries around the world, the private sector of the national community wanted protection. They did not want to face competition. They did not want to face globalization. They did not want to face the different issues which would make it a much more effective economy. And that is why the biggest challenge that we have basically are two things. To be able to work with governments to deal with issues in a multidimensional factor, not in a linear factor. And secondly, to try and change the mindset and creating an awareness. This is a journey. This is not just a destination of producing a document. And what we are trying to do with governments is to create benchmarking. So, for example, if we engage with the government of Jordan, with the government of Egypt, with the government of Bahrain and Morocco, we put benchmarking. And I think what we can see is maybe down the road, and I don't mean down the road too far away, some positive movements on some key economic issues which can make a difference and address the issues that both Professor Cooper and Fred mentioned. We've had events in several countries. We in Egypt are developing a conference that would work on that. We had an event in other countries earlier in the year. And my feeling is, quite frankly, that for us to position ourselves as a catalyst for change, we need to continue down that journey. I'll stop here and leave it to Mohammed.
Can I suggest, Shafiq, that we just quickly, if we could just put up on the screen very quickly the one or two slides on the economic liberalization plan. If you just want to take us very quickly through some of the key points, and then Mohammed could maybe talk about governance and human development.
The key components, I mean, one of the critical components.
They're right there, next slide.
Professor Cooper mentioned about the issue of wealth and the issue of education, also on the issue that Fred mentioned on unemployment. Those are the issues that you see on the screen that we have sort of put as a priority list that we need to engage with governments on the economic liberalization side. That's one of a three-pronged policy that we want to follow related to economic liberalization. And one of the things that I would say, rather than just listing these, is an experience that we went through in Egypt. In Egypt during the period of 90 to 97, as we went through our economic reform, two of the obstacles we faced was the reform was personalized. It was not institutionalized. And that is why you see right here the importance of building an institutional capacity to make the reform sustainable. The other is the importance of creating a constituency that supports not only foreign direct investment in human resources, but also engaged in removing all restrictions and impediments to the growth issues, be it trade or investment. That constituency is what makes it sustainable.
Thank you very much, Shafiq. Mohammed, do you want to play with the slides or not? Because then I'll tell.
play with the slides.
Okay, so we'll go to the governance slides, please. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, what I'm about to say is not really rocket science. I think when we sit and think about the weaknesses and the solutions, I think it's have been studied, has been reviewed, everyone knows it. So I'll just touch base not only on my slide, but the World Bank meeting in Dubai have highlighted that the Arab world also need two very important initiatives: inclusiveness and accountability. Inclusiveness is really participation in decision making, and accountability, we talk about transparency. So pretty much the whole world agrees what's the agenda. So if I were to move straight away into governance, of course, we touch base on things like the rule of law, which no two people will disagree on, enhancing transparency, the issue of corruption and favoritism that exists not only in our part of the world, but many other places as well, even in the Western world. The public sector and evaluating that, the quality of the public sector, the issue of improving legal mechanism for not only dispute settlement, but in general, the reform of the judiciary system. When it comes to human resources, of course, again, I don't think there are any two people who will disagree on this, which is quality of education and improving the quality on an ongoing basis. The training side of human resources development, the link between the business community and educational institutions, and making sure that the business sector gets satisfied and their needs are met. The role of women, I don't think I'm the first one to talk about, because I think many people have repeated and studied the issue. They are 50% of the society. We need to engage them. We need to get their energy and productivity to participate in the growth. But what I would like to highlight is that I would like to comment that I think if it's oil or non-oil, I think unfortunately the Arab world have difficulty in oil-producing countries and countries that don't produce oil. So the unfortunate thing is that it's a common disease. That's, I think, my comment number one. The other thing is that I think enough promises have been made in the past, so I think that we ought to stop, and enough is enough. As well, I think we ourselves, if you read, there's a lot to blame. We blame others for so much. But unfortunately, I think we should blame ourselves for not managing our affairs right, which is something that not many people would like to highlight. I think that's a very critical issue. This state of victimhood that exists in the Arab world, I think, in governments or with people themselves, I think that have to stop. And I'm so happy that my colleagues in Bahrain are building Formula One. I certainly hope that the Arab world jumps on Formula One and move as fast as Formula One, because time have run out. The other thing is that I think Renaissance is long overdue. And I'm glad that Sean and our colleagues have brought in this concept. Therefore, business must do more. Politicians need help. I'm very close to politicians. Politicians, they really mean well. They want to move on, but truly, trust me, some of them don't know how to go about it. They mean good, but they really don't know how to go about it. It's a very complicated, fast-moving world. So I think we should move on and participate and collaborate with them. Why? Because I think we in the business community, we're very good in marketing. So I think we should help government when it comes to that. One very important thing is that many of us who are depending on oil, I think many of these governments truly believe that the real wealth is the black liquid underground. I think the real wealth is in the minds of our young people, including my children, which many of our governments and business community have forgotten. Therefore, I truly believe that it's all, whatever we are calling for, it's really part and parcel of our culture, tradition, and Islamic beliefs. Therefore, I don't think we should really reinvent and do anything that's totally new. Therefore, I think the key driver to whatever we do and whatever slide we put, I think we should go into the business of building minds of young people that will need 6 million jobs every single year for the coming 15 years. And that's why you're right. It has never been done before. At the end, I just would like to say that I think if we do not control our own destiny, I think somebody else will. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Now, I'd like to turn to the panel and start with you, Your Highness Sheikh Salman. We've just had a very brief sketch of a plan for development coming from a representative group of Arab business leaders. Shafiq mentioned that even the business community is fragmented in that part of the world, and this is an effort to bring people together with a common vision, trying to identify common denominators. We see other regions in the world like the NEPAD in Africa or the Lisbon criteria for Europe in terms of making Europe the most competitive bloc by 2005. Is there such a vision, cohesive vision in the Arab world amongst governments? If not, why not? And is that in fact desirable?
Well, let me start by saying that I agree absolutely with everything that's been said here. All of these issues are key, and I will not repeat them. Suffice to say that all across the Arab world there are barriers erected, both between inter-Arab relationships and internally to their own countries. There are barriers to trade, which I did not hear mentioned. Inter-Arab trade is one of the smallest regional trading relationships globally. There are barriers to ideas. People are still too sensitive. People culturally expect to conform to a norm without recognizing the need to strengthen the individual over the society. There are barriers to people. People aren't allowed to move freely between the whole region. So the look or the outlook for the region needs really to concentrate on three things, which is free market, rule of law, democracy, and justice. Those three elements really will focus the growth and the development in the region. On the economic side, I think what is lacking is an understanding of how structurally uncompetitive the region is, both internally within their own countries, as Shafir so rightly mentioned. The problem exists on both sides of the equation, both in the public sector and in the private sector. The public sector being quite unresponsive and slow to the needs of the young entrepreneur, and the traditional private sector being very jealous about the rights that they have earned over the last many years. So we really need to break that cycle and that symbiotic relationship whereby stability is maintained, but innovation, strength, courage, entrepreneurship is really strangled and destroyed. You mentioned a very important statistic, which is that in order to generate sufficient employment, we need to grow at 4%. Now, as we all know, a very important factor in competitiveness is productivity. So in reality, our economies will need to grow faster than our employment if we are to achieve real reform. And if we're starting with a benchmark of 4% for employment, that means that our economic growth needs to be higher than 4%, which is not easy to do across the whole region. If we benchmark ourselves against modern developed economies, I think you will find that the Arab world's productivity index is somewhere in the region of, if we take the US as 100%, we're roughly in the region of about 30 to 40% productivity. Now that is, ladies and gentlemen, not sustainable in the long run. This needs to be addressed. We cannot continue to, for example, in the Gulf states, continue on a low skill or low cost labor market that is really just destroying any chance of future productivity. This is the real problem that we have in the Gulf region, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, UAE, everywhere else. The economies are built on cheap expatriate labor. This cannot continue. In the rest of the Arab world, huge economies such as Egypt, productivity needs to be increased by creating a much more dynamic private sector and removing all of the barriers that block things like hiring and firing of workers. things that block international investment, allowing capital to freely move in and out of the country. All of these things need to be maintained and strengthened and encouraged so that our productivity index can rise from where it is now, which is quite low, to be honest, to where it needs to be so that we can be globally competitive. It will be a very happy day for me when I can look to one Arab brand that is recognized internationally. And today I cannot see it.
Thank you, Sheikh Salman.
Thank you.
Before other members of the panel intervene, I wanted to just take a few impressions from the audience because we're touching on the same subjects. If you could take up your voting devices. And I'd like to ask 2-3 questions. First of all, you see, you have one answer possible only per question. What is currently driving the impetus for reform in the Arab world? And you have 4 choices there. 1, it's the U.S. agenda. 2, the stagnation of Arab economies. 3, growing frustration of Arab citizens towards their leaders. 4, the pressures of globalization. So please vote now.
Yes, number 1. What do you think it's going to be?
Number 3.
I think it's going to be number 5.
Is the voting finished now? Okay, interesting. Number 3. 38%, the growing frustration of Arab citizens. 17% on the stagnation of Arab economies. 20% on the U.S. agenda. And 23% on globalization. Good, we're going to take 2 more questions, then we'll come back to these. Second question, what should be the priority for Arab governments in terms of reform? Is it reform on the economic side, on the political side, on the educational side, or on ICT, internet communication technologies development, information communication technologies? Please vote. Okay, the voting's finished on that one. Interesting also. Political reform going way ahead of economic reform. And here's a third question. Arab governments are undertaking more reforms than they actually get credit for. Do you strongly agree, somewhat agree, or do you strongly disagree? Let's please have a vote on that now. Okay, that vote's finished. Okay, well, now that I've made the job...
Do you make any money if you score right on all?
I've made the job of the next interventions perhaps a little bit more difficult, but a little bit more spicy. And I think we are here to have that kind of a spicy discussion, right, Shafiq? It's interesting, Bassem, that the results here from this audience, and I'm wondering if we do not find a certain shift perhaps with last year, is that the driving impetus for reform in the Arab world is close to 40% is attributed to the frustration of citizens towards their own leaders. And I'd like to see if the panel, Bassem, maybe Andre, Gamal Mubarak, you'd like to comment on that.
Thanks, Fred. I think the message that's coming loud and clear is that Arab governments and Arab civil societies have failed to act over the last few years. Let me just back a little bit and say that the whole concept of Renaissance, when we speak about Renaissance in the European model, when during the 14th to 16th century, the European countries came out of stagnation into prosperity and growth, Renaissance was not only associated with economic activities, but was more associated with the art, with the science, with political thought, not only economic growth and development. That leads us to the question about the ability of Arab societies, and I'm not only limiting it to Arab governments, to rethink, to reformulate the models of development and the socio-economic frameworks that have been governing the Arab world for the last so many years. This is something that is not happening. We are here yet again to define what is wrong with the Arab world. We all know the demographics of the Arab world. We all know the challenges of the Arab world. The vote showed that the increasing frustration of Arab people with the pressing demands of unemployment, with social issues, with poverty, are really pressing. And these are defining the agenda for reform for Arab societies. Now, what have we done about that? We've been engaged in a moot discussion about whether reform should be dictated to us from Washington or whether we should come up with a blueprint of reform from inside the region. We've been engaged in a moot discussion about how different we are from each other and therefore we cannot adopt one single model of reform, forgetting that the same problems really plague us all, which is unemployment, which is poverty, which is the lack of political freedoms and the lack of power and empowerment for women across the Arab world. These are the real issues that are confronting the Arab world. But they've been defined already. The UNDP Human Development Report has defined them. The Arab Competitiveness Report has defined them. What have we done about that? What have Arab governments done in terms of the issues that His Royal Highness just mentioned? Trade liberalization. What have we done about that? What have we done about increasing productivity? What are the specific policies adopted by individual governments over the last year in terms of enhancing the productivity of the labor force in the Arab world? What are the education programs that are there in the Arab world that are supposed to match the output of the education process with the requirements of the labor market? What are the vocational programs, the policies for vocation programs in the Arab world that are designed to absorb all the newcomers in the labor market every year? So these are issues that need to be looked at, and we need to judge Arab governments individually about what they are doing, what they have done, what they are going to do for the next year. If we really want to move forward and not to sit a year from now and debate the same issues, we need to articulate these issues. More importantly, as the vote showed, the political concerns are real as well. The political reform issue is a real one in the Arab world, and we would be deceiving ourselves if we think that this is just an invention coming from Washington. What have Arab governments done about encouraging an environment that would allow for political parties to emerge in their societies? What has the civil society in the Arab world done in terms of looking at individual freedoms and harnessing the kind of environment that exists today in order to advance the role of women, to advance judicial reforms, to advance administrative reforms, accountability, inclusiveness, as Muhammad mentioned? These are issues that are real, and we find that Arab governments over the last year, we don't want to move too back, but to say over the last year, let us have a balance sheet of what individual governments have done over the last year in terms of addressing these issues. And that's how you understand the 63% vote of strongly disagreeing with Arab governments moving on this case of reform. They have not moved on the case of reform. Many governments, as Shafiq mentioned, are still in denial that they need to reform. They think that this present administration is going to go away and then the pressure from Washington is going to stop and you will not have any pressing demand. They forget the real need. What is at the bottom of the quest for reform are the Arab people, their ambitions and their outlook for the future. We need to address that.
Thank you, Bassem. Andre, you've been involved in development policies for many years in your country. And I know you want to make a comment on some of the votes, but I find it very interesting that on the one hand, as you mentioned, close to 40% feedback here goes to the issue of growing frustration of Arab citizens. They want to see their living standards raised. On the other hand, the audience feels that the priority in terms of reform is not on the economic side, but should be on the political side. Isn't there a bit of a disconnect there somehow?
No, I think it's totally coherent, and just want to say that I agree totally with what was said now, and I want also to share with you maybe a different perception. I mean, I'm very happy that this concept of Renaissance in the Arab world is emerging, but to tell you the truth, many of us and many of our countries have started a long time ago. this new vision of the future. And this new vision is forged and based on a global policy. I mean, now what is important is to know that even in the Arab world, we consider with the same priority and the same commitment our political reforms than our competitiveness. We know that there is a direct linkage between the two. And when you have also a project based on political reforms, democracy, competitiveness, culture, a better answer to the civil societies, and you have a kind of balance of everything. You are more competitive. You are also, I mean, more able to forge partnership with the rest of the world. And what is the most important is that the frustration of your people, of your population is different. And if for a long time we were working just on the economic reform for years. And let's say that we put on the side the democracy, human rights, the women's status, the culture, the perception we have of ourselves. I mean, we were always looking on the eyes of the others to see what we are and what we can do. Today, I can just testify of that in many of our countries, we know exactly what we are, we know our potential, we know what we have to do to be competitive tomorrow, we know where we are weak, and we know also what could be, I mean, the role of our population and of our civil society. There is a deep trend and a dynamic in many of our countries to try to be part of this game. And I think that the involvement, the implication of the civil societies in many of our countries is a vital asset. It's a new dimension of the situation in many Arab countries, and it could change a lot for tomorrow. And I can tell you, speaking of my country, in Morocco, that, for instance, the rhythm of our growth changed dramatically when we speed the political reforms. More democracy means more competitiveness. It's true, it's proved, and it is something now which is, I mean, we cannot avoid. We know also that more culture and more inclusion of the culture in the economic strategy means also more competitiveness. I can tell you, for instance, in Morocco, we have 300,000 people working in the textile business. And we know that in 5-6 years from now, we cannot compete with the Chinese. But if we put in our production more Moroccan parameters, more Moroccan design, more Moroccan culture, we will compete with the Chinese in a different league, but we will still continue to be partner and to be a player in this game. If we just want to be competitiveness on the meter price, it's finished. That's why I think it's very important to try to keep this momentum for a global approach, a more coherent vision, and above all, to try to capitalize and to leverage with the maximum of creativity our own capability.
Thank you, Andre. Now, I'm reminded of what Carly Fiorina said to us yesterday, that competitiveness is the license to participate in the global economy. And I think that's this is a theme that we've been hearing from the panel. I would like to go to question number 5. I'd like to skip question number 4, and I'd like to go to question number 5 for the voting system, if you can take your voting devices. And then we're going to take some questions from the floor as well. That an Arab Renaissance largely depends on Saudi Arabia and Egypt accelerating their political, social, economic reform process. Do you agree or do you disagree? If we can have a vote on that now, please. the two largest countries of the region. Okay, we'll stop the vote. Agree. Good. Well, Gamal, and I see Minister Boutros Ghali is here too, so if you'd like to make a comment, please make a sign. I'd like you to comment on this because I was hoping that this was going to be the result, so thank you to the audience, but
I'm happy with the
it's
result
not
too,
rigged, it's not rigged. No.
I'm happy with the result too, by the way.
You're okay, well, good. Well, we'd like to hear about you, and I'd also like to ask you, just trying to pull together what we've heard from the other panelists, if you could also give us your impression, do you think that Arab governments are at a tipping point? Are we at a tipping point here in terms of change of thought? But please,
Sure, thanks.
on this first.
Before I answer this question right away, let me just make a few quick comments to set the stage on my side just to complement what my other colleagues in the panel have said. Now, there was a question before, and I guess sort of Bassem also commented on it, is the need and desire and call for reform, and part of the reason we're having this session, I guess, in Davos this year, is this because of outside pressure being enforced on the Arab world, given what has happened in the region in the past 2 years? Or is it because of a real serious desire of our local constituents, each and everyone in his own respective country, the desire to accelerate, to change, to catch up with the world at large, which has moved at a much faster pace than we have? I tend to subscribe to the second one. There is a real and serious desire and pressure being put by our own local constituents. I believe I can speak with more authority about Egypt, to speed reform, to move deeper in our comprehensive reform program to catch up with the rest of the world. Now, I'm not ignoring world events. I'm not ignoring what happened in 9/11, the war in Iraq last year. I mean, any government in the region cannot ignore, but deal with the consequences and the ramifications that these events impose. But the real thrust for reform and for moving forward is coming from our own domestic constituents. The second point I'd like to make, so we just don't lose focus of a very important issue. We have to realize, and I think the way this question was worded, saying whether Egypt and Saudi Arabia have to accelerate, I just want to make it clear that we're not starting from scratch. And I can talk about Egypt with more authority. We have been engaged, and when I say we, I mean the society at large, not only the government, in a comprehensive economic, political, and social reform program for more than 2 decades. During this process, we as a society, led by the government, have made some strategic political choices on foreign policy, a major shift on peace in the region, pioneering the efforts back in the late 70s and paying a heavy price for it. On economic, social, and political reform, reforming the role of government, opening up the room for the private sector to lead, bringing down barriers for civil society to take its real and deserved role in society, moving more and more in opening the society for debate, participation, and dissent. And I can obviously add to what has been said before, that without moving in parallel in all those dimensions, it would have been impossible. Given the shortcomings that I'm going to talk about, it would have been impossible to achieve what we have achieved over the past 2 decades. Now, this reform process did achieve some relative success, but also has come with its failures. And there have been a lot of disappointments on the way along. And if we look back and try and see what we hope to achieve through that process of reform, I think we still fall short on many areas, which means that we still have a long way ahead of us. We need to move into deeper reforms across the board in the years to come. But let me point out to the audience, again judging from my experience, or from our experience in Egypt, one of, I believe, the relative successes that we have achieved over the past 20 years is that the policy choices that we made across the board, the changes that we have instituted in our society, again across the board, have become well entrenched, and I can even dare to say have become irreversible. Let me give you an example. I find it almost inconceivable, if not politically suicidal, if one of the opposition parties in Egypt today, which does happen to have a totally different perception and ideology than the ruling party has today, if one of the opposition parties does come to power, or gets into a coalition even with the ruling party or government today, I find it inconceivable, if not politically suicidal, for them to reverse course on some of those fundamental policy choices that we have made. On foreign policy, on regional issues, on peace, on economic liberalization, on trade liberalization. It would be just too costly. And the society would not allow them to do that. Notwithstanding the fact that as they stand in opposition today, they are attacking, they are criticizing. Now, where do we go from here? Again, as far as Egypt is concerned, we are moving into a phase, in our next phase of comprehensive reform, where even more difficult choices and decisions will have to be made. I want to pick up on the issue of education. Obviously, I agree with what has been mentioned, that education is obviously a key ingredient in reform moving forward. Improving the skill of young graduates coming out to the labor market and the workforce. Most of us, I guess, agree and converge on what needs to be done in education. Back home, the government has been working hard on implementing a quite ambitious economic reform, education reform. But let me tell you what is a very hotly debated issue right now. Difficult choice lies ahead. How do you finance and fund all these ambitious programs for education reform? It's a key, highly politicized issue. Do we continue the way things have been, again in Egypt in specific, where the government bears the lion's share of investment in education? Or do we have to start branching out, where the society has to take part of that burden? That's a decision, and that's a choice that the society has to make. Let me give another example. Local government. With the challenges that Egypt faces, there is no way around improving the effectiveness of local government to take and assume responsibility to developing the local societies. Now, we've had local council elections for decades. Obviously, the process needs improvement. But the big challenge we're discussing and debating now is how to make local councils more effective. What kind of responsibilities and authority need to be devolved from central government to local government in order to be held responsible and accountable, and in order to hold the local executives accountable too. Hotly debated, tough choices and issues and decisions that we have to make moving forward, which also links, and I agree with the panelists about the issue of moving in parallel on political, social, and economic reform and trying to deepen and widen the process of participation. Now, what is compounding the challenge? Some of my colleagues talked about the resistance coming from the business sector, rightly so. We should not be painting the picture that the business sector is reform-minded, wants to move forward, trade liberalization, and it's the government that's only the one holding back. There is resistance from corners in the business sector who have been used to protection and so on. But let me tell you a wider issue here. In Egypt, in our domestic political arena, we still have, and this is still remnants of the past, we still have political parties divided along clear ideological lines. We haven't seen the convergence that has happened in Europe and in the West of left and right, conservative and labor and so on moving closer together. We still have those dividing lines. And this, I think, makes it more difficult for the government in power, for the majority party, to find ways and means to engage more effectively, to find ways and means to make the process of reform much more inclusive than it ever has been in the past, and to make sure that we have an effective message to be able to gain the support of the society at large for the difficult and painful choices that lie ahead. Now, once again, I don't want to paint the picture that the reform process has been a resounding success. Again, I said, we've had our failures, and we have a wealth of experience to look back at and try to learn from those mistakes. But the road ahead is even more challenging. The road ahead needs a more inclusive process, much ever than it has been before, and it needs political parties reforming themselves, even within existing laws, which might also need some changes and amendments, but reforming the way they conduct their business. We are still, in most of the political parties in Egypt, still under the guise of populist policies. What we're trying to do, what I'm trying to do with many of my colleagues in the National Democratic Party, is to shift gear into more pragmatic policies and a more pragmatic platform. To answer the question clearly, I agree with what the panel has, what the audience have mentioned, that Egypt and Saudi Arabia and possibly others do have a big responsibility in accelerating and moving forward. We historically have always had a responsibility in the region, whether in regional issues or in domestic issues. And I think we take that responsibility seriously, but we engage with our fellow Arab countries. We have a lot to learn from each other, despite the fact that our circumstances might be different.
Thank you very much, Gamal. I'd like to go to the floor. I see there's a question here, and if, okay, let's take this one first. Okay, I'm going to take 2-3 questions at a time, so go ahead, please.
My name is Rabin Zoran, and just fast in reference to the voting and the other parties, all the voting seems to be all the time 99.9 for the establishment and none for the others. I didn't hear about the other parties. But that's not really the subject matter of the question. Isn't the Arab economy going more towards services? No industry. I don't hear about creating industries. I hear about exporting capital from the oil revenues and services. So what do? We created an Arab economy that does depend on exporting capital, importing services and products. How do you guys expect to get jobs going if you are exporting your capital outside and importing goods and services? Now, combine that with the dictatorship in the Arab world or the political system. Could you really develop the economy without developing a political system that addresses these issues at the root level? And instead of blaming the United States, why don't we learn from the United States and Europe the issues of democracy and how to go forward, and then apply the economic value structure to these issues? And I'd like to see the panel comment on that.
Thank you. Can you just introduce yourself, please?
Rabin Zoran.
From?
I'm American now, but I am an immigrant.
Okay. There was a question here, and there's one over there. Okay, a couple questions over there, too. Right behind you.
Yes, thank you. I'm Mr. Seidenfaden from Denmark. My question concerns political reform. There seems to be a great consensus, an impressive consensus in favor of political reform. And so my question is, since we all know that whether we're talking democracies or non-democracies or half-democracies, always there needs to be a political coalition behind change, behind reform. And I would like especially the three panelists who have political responsibilities in their countries to comment on what kind of domestic coalitions could be supporting such political reform. I mean, in terms of social groups, in terms of institutions, in terms of ideological values to mobilize people, in terms of political movements. What are the instruments or what are the foundations in domestic politics for this political reform that you all seem to want? Because if we want it to happen, we need to have a causal foundation for it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We're going to go very quick, and I'm going to ask for some short answers. Take one more question here since the mic is there, and then I'd like the microphone to go to the other side.
Yeah, Christopher Dickey with Newsweek. Every time I hear these discussions, I have a feeling that they take place in a vacuum. Nobody talks about the role of the defense budgets, the role of the army in the society, which in Egypt, for instance, lives as a class apart. And nobody talks about the role of the Mukhabarat, the secret police, in affecting the political structures of these countries. I'd like to see anybody on the panel address those questions honestly and forthrightly.
Thank you, sir. Okay. We're gonna go to the panel now, and we'll get the microphone to the other side. So there's the issue of the first question on political reform and and services, but leading to economic reform, because there was also the issue of dictatorship that was raised. But I wish Lee Kuan Yew was here. But you want to take that? Okay, Shafiq, you take that, and then there's the one on political reform and domestic coalitions.
My response is this, and services is good. We have in the Arab world sort of had this slogan that we have to industrialize, and we had a slogan even in Egypt 40 years ago where we had to produce everything across the board. And I, as a businessman going around the Arab world, see that many of the Arab economies are built similarly, not based on competitive advantage, not based on competitiveness, which is a mistake. As a matter of fact, the services industry is the fastest growing industry in the Western world. The United States economy is based on the services industry. It's not based on industry, as a matter of fact. In Egypt, a very large proportion of employment comes from the services industry. So my point in response to this question is that we need to look at our comparative advantage and also look at our competitive advantage globally, and not just focus on industry that we can just sell locally and can't sell externally. I think that's an important component. As far as dictatorship, I'll leave that to the audience, to the other panelists. But I would say, from my experience, I can tell you that there is no one format. Look at what happened in China or what happened in Singapore. But I think what is key is that for economic liberalization and to move forward, you need to have the political environment and the economic environment that can allow that to go ahead.
So, Your Highness, how do we move forward?
Well, I mean, there seems to be a number of issues here. First of all, the Arab world is not homogeneous. There are different systems of government, different levels of government intervention into the private sector and into people's personal lives. Countries from the west to the east are quite different in their outlook. Speaking for my country, the civil society that developed, and I know I could speak for a number of other Arab countries, with the political reform process that we engaged in, and to answer, for example, the role of the secret police, the abolishment of the state security law, the right for individuals to have representation at trials to be all public, no more secret police trials, all of that, the general amnesty declared for all political prisoners, all of those things took place in Bahrain. So the secret police, in the classical sense that seems to be some sort of shadowy organization that rules people's lives, no longer exists, in my country at least. In terms of our ability to export our capital and to import services, we are part of a global community, and I think it's important that we engage in trade that goes both ways. Now, through that trade, we can learn and develop institutions, we develop factories, we develop ideas are exchanged that lead to economic growth. And as Shafiq so rightly said, the services that developed in the West have now come to our region, for example in Bahrain, one of the only sectors where productivity is growing as well as the sector, economically in terms of size and importance, is growing is banking. So it's a success story in Bahrain. Banking is a success story. A number of other sectors aren't doing so well. But that's one sector where services are playing an extremely important part in the development, the social development of our own people. Now, the role of the army, this is the same role that it plays in any other part of the world.
It's more about the budgets, I think, the budgets that are allocated to defense.
HDI, well, I think there's a very clear indicator that you can use, which is the amount of money spent on education and health in relationship to the money spent on defense. And countries all across the Arab world score differently on this.
Yeah, well,
some score well, some score badly. So it's up to you, both the people from that part of the world and the international community, to advise those that score badly to change their methods. And it's also up to you to tell the people that score well, thank you very much. So I think you can't use one size fits all in this debate, as Shafiq so rightly said from the beginning.
And we thank you, Bahrain, and I see Qatar is also here with Minister Al-Attiyah. Bassem.
Well, for this discussion not to be conducted in a void, as Chris mentioned, let us be very realistic. The reality is that the overwhelming majority of the Arab people across the Arab world is under the age of 30. Anywhere between 70 to 80%, if you look at individual Arab countries, of the people in any one of the Arab countries is under the age of 30 years old. Now this is the future of the Arab world. Let's not look to the past. The past is a past of misery. Let's look to a future of promise. The future is going to be conducted by those young generations of Arabs who have access to the internet, who have access to satellite television, who watch CNN and Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya and all the other satellite channels, who have expectations and who expect to have equal opportunity. They do not expect the intelligence services to intrude on their lives if they do not threaten the security of the state, and they expect to have personal freedoms. This is a very general view of what young Arabs are expecting. They are totally obsessed with the issue of jobs and with the issue of employment. And this is what we need to cater for. This is going to be the domestic constituency that will move reform. Yes, reform and political pluralism, for it to be part of Arab societies and for us to move from, in our political systems, from a tribal system into a more pluralistic, democratic, inclusive civil society system, that needs a lot of work. That means that we need to harness the young generation of Arabs to think about platforms, educational platforms and health platforms and political freedoms as well, in order to articulate the agenda for the Arab world.
Thank you. Your Highness, I know you have to leave, so maybe I will,
Yes,
you have a meeting and you're here till Sunday?
Yes.
So, I mean, there's many other opportunities. Thank you for participating. We're just going to take a few more questions for the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
There were, okay. If you don't mind, I'm going to take one or two questions also before we come to you,
Because
Gamal.
Egypt was mentioned in a specific question, so I'd like to have a chance to respond.
Okay, well, then you can start in your response by, okay, take a few, just 2-3 more questions that were over there. Yes, please. And over there in the corner, by the curtain.
Yeah, I would like to ask any member of this...
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, my name is Musab Korma. I would like to ask any member of this distinguished panel and a comment from Professor Cooper. I don't think anyone can disagree with what has been mentioned regarding the impediments that need to be overcome to achieve progress in the region. However, an issue that was not addressed is the issue of human rights. How big of an issue is the issue of human rights, and what needs to happen in order to achieve reform and progress?
Thank you. And then one question by the curtain there.
Thank you very much. My name is Basil Eastwood. I was formerly British ambassador in Damascus, which may influence my question, which is to suggest or seek comment on the proposal that the war on terror may actually be tending to reinforce the Mukhabarat state and to be in contradiction to the US drive for democracy in the region. I'd be grateful for comment. Thank you.
Okay, quite a latitude of questions here. I don't want to repeat what the distinguished panelists mentioned about some of the issues that were asked, but I just want to get back to the question about the constituency, which was asked from the audience. I think I've tried to explain, again, in our experience in Egypt, the need for, especially moving forward, of making the process of reform more inclusive. And it is that, for that very specific region that you mentioned, that the difficult choices that lie ahead is not just an issue of governments deciding to reform and move ahead and just going ahead and implementing change. We have to make sure, rightly sir, as you said, that there is a constituency that's going to support the kind of difficult choices that lie ahead across the spectrum of reform. Now, this constituency, especially in the past 2 or 3 years, and that's an issue which obviously has not been brought up today, and I'd like to highlight it. Given what has happened in the region the past 2 years, given the lingering problem in the Middle East, the chronic issue of the Palestinian-Israeli problem, I can tell you, sir, in Egypt specifically, and I'm sure it's the case in many other Arab countries, this is not considered by our own constituents as a foreign policy issue. This has been, and will continue to be, a domestic policy issue. We did a poll a year ago in preparation for our annual party conference. Going out, asking a representative sample of society, what are the pressing priority issues you would like to see the party address in its annual conference? And the Palestinian-Israeli problem scored among the highest of what they believe as a domestic issue. The reason I'm bringing this up, because a few years back, we were hearing voices and analysts, especially in the West, saying, listen, this problem has been abused for years by the Arab world to delay reform. Well, I can talk about Egypt. I don't think we can be held guilty for this because, as I said, we've made a strategic choice in the late 70s, more than 25 years ago. But what's happening now? We're talking about reform and we should. We have to move ahead for reform. We have to engage with the world and we should. But we should not say, then let's just ignore this other problem. Let's get reform first. Let's get reform on the Palestinian Authority side, and then we talk about resolving the issue. This is not going to help, I can tell you sincerely from first-hand experience, the efforts and the programs of reform and of reformers, not necessarily government, in society, of forging ahead and moving forward. Quick question about elections and so on.
Very quick answer, okay?
Very quick answer. I guess we all agree that we need to move in parallel. Economic, social, and political reform. And over the past years, I think you have seen a lot of positive steps, in the conduct of elections and in the room that has been given, rightly so, for opposition parties and members in different countries. The last point on Egypt and the military. I don't know if the gentleman left. Yes, sir, we are very proud of our military, but the military establishment in Egypt has not been part and has never interfered in politics for at least the past 25 years. So we are proud of that institution. But the fact is it has not stepped into or interfered in politics for the past 25 years.
Thank you, Gamal. Andre, you wanted to comment, and we're going to end the session by just voting on question number 6 and question number 9, and that will end our session. But it'll give some meat maybe to the lunch on reforming Arab economies that takes place today. Andre.
Yes, just a short comment to avoid any misunderstanding or confusion. We are engaged in many of our countries to a process of deepening and accelerating the rhythm of our political reforms. But many of us are not ready just to duplicate in our countries a system coming from the rest of the world. We are enough aware of what we are. We are not enough aware of what was our civilization, as it was said at the beginning, that we know that we are able to build our own democracy, for instance. We stick to the universal definition of human rights, of pluralism, of freedom, but we are not ready to give up by just keeping aside what is also our legacy, our heritage. And for instance, I think that in our part of the world, considering some other factors who are also vital, because democracy it's not just an academic approach or a theory. If you look in many of our countries, the way, for instance, the retired people, the old generation are treated, we can give some advice. I'm not saying lessons, but some ways to many other countries who are reputed or who are known as very democratic. What happens, for instance, in Europe last summer, because of very severe drought, having old people dying nowhere in hospices is something which is totally unbelievable, inconceivable in our part of the world. And it's also democracy. And I think it's important also to address this issue of the gap of knowledge, of appreciation, of ignorance we are also confronted to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andre. Mohammed, a very quick comment, please.
My quick comment is that, number one, I think if you look at the result of this little question, please
We
keep in mind.
haven't voted yet.
No, I mean in
Yeah.
general, but just keep in mind that our audience, they're people who can afford to buy a ticket to come to Davos. So I think if you were to ask it to anyone who cannot buy a bus ticket, I think the answer is going to be so much worse. That's number one. Number two, when you
Worse.
talk about much worse, of course. These guys cannot buy a ticket to go on a bus. And
I
we've got
understand.
well-off people here. So number two, so the result is very good compared to reality. Number two, I think if you talk about cannot do one thing that fits the Arab world because 22 countries, 300 million people, different countries, please remember India. They are 1 billion people. They have 45 religions. They have God knows how many languages, and they create the greatest democracy in the world with 7% annual growth. So I disagree with some of the comments that have been made earlier.
Thank you, Mohammed. Yeah, well, I think it's part of the complexity of the issues that we're confronting. And in a short hour, I think we've brushed through of a wide variety of challenges and only touched a little bit on some of the solutions. Let's take a quick vote on this. What is the most important change? And we're sounding out the people who are here in Davos that Arab people want to, the Arab world like to see. One, a resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And two, the U.S. taking a more balanced role. Three, the advent of greater democracy. And four, a better standard of living. Let's vote. And we're not going to be able to have a discussion on this. I'm just going to end the session with the results of this question and of the next question. I'm going to have to stop. Okay, this is interesting. And I actually posed this question at a session like this one in this room last year with the same categories. And I'll give you the results of last year. The resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict last year was ranked at 60%. And the better standard of living last year ranked at 18%. So it's interesting to see, of course, this is, this has to be taken with a certain degree of it's not very scientific, but it seems to see that people are maybe also getting fed up of the Palestinian-Israeli issue. Rising living standards seems to be the issue that is on the rise in the Arab world. Last question, please, and no, the last question, question 9. Question 9, thank you. An Arab Renaissance will begin to take place over the next 5 years, yes or no? Press 1 for yes, no for, 2 for no. Please vote. Okay. Well, on this, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to. It's the struggle of ideas, yes. I'd like to thank all of you, and there are many other sessions in the program on this issue. Thank you.